Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Daniel. I'm based in Singapore and I curate at the National Museum of Singapore. I'm very happy to introduce our speaker for today, who is Dr. Anthony Medrano. Anthony is the Presidential Young Professor of Environmental Studies at UNUS College. He's concurrently a faculty member at the Department of History at the National University of Singapore, and also an associate with the Lee Kong Chian Natural History Museum in Singapore. And I think that's probably the connecting point for us. We were just chatting earlier about a common friend and colleague, Martin Low, at the museum, and I believe it was Martin who first introduced us. And I think we've at the museum in Singapore, we've had the pleasure of hosting Anthony and several of his classes at UNUS to at our Going Through gallery featuring the William Farquhar collection. And Anthony has done really wonderful work looking at environmental histories, the legacies of economic life, scientific practice, and biodiversity research. And when I was thinking of who would be suitable to present this talk today, I remembered the chapter that Anthony contributed to the book that was edited by Tim Barnard, Singaporean Creatures, Histories of Humans and Other Animals in the Garden City. And in that chapter, Anthony talks about tilapia and the migratory histories of that species. And it was really out of that we have scoped the talk for today. While tilapia, the focus on tilapia looks quite at the makings of a kind of Singaporean creature. Today, Anthony will be talking to us about both the Mozambique tilapia as well as the snakeskin gourami, and as two case studies that really talk about the migratory histories and the interplay of humans and non-humans in the connected histories of Malaysia, Singapore, and Brunei, something that's very close to what we are interested in here at the Malaysian branch of the Royal Asiatic Society. So without further ado, I'd be very happy to pass the time to Anthony to share with us his thought for today.
Thanks so much for that introduction, Daniel, and thank you to all of those who are listening in right now. Thanks as well to the Malaysian branch of the Royal Asiatic Society for the invitation to really share some preliminary, I think, thoughts and also some preliminary research about how we might do biodiversity history and how we might think differently about the connections and exchanges within the region. I mean, we often think about the movement of things, typically humans and people working the land or working the water. But another thing that moved around quite a lot throughout history were species, non-human species. So in my case, what I'm looking at here is the movement of fish. So it's like I said in the beginning, it's very preliminary, but I want to walk through maybe some ideas about why I'm thinking about fish, what I hope to maybe kind of point to, and then I'll go into these kind of two stories. One's very rough. That's the Siam story, the snakeskin gourami story. It's a bit rough, but I hope to draw out some clarity. And then the other story is the Mozambique tilapia. And I want to sort of think through these two different fish for both the histories that they embody in terms of their movements and the reasons why they were introduced, but also for what they can maybe offer us as scholars of Malaysia, Brunei, Singapore, Indonesia, the sort of the larger region, what fish can offer us in terms of telling new types of stories with new kinds of actors, I think, driving the narrative, human and non-human actors. So I've sort of somewhat retitled the paper or this talk today to Sepat stories in and out of Malayan waters. And Sepat is, and perhaps people in the audience or listening in, you might be able to offer me some better guidance here. But it seems to be a word. I mean, one of the earliest references to it that I found was from 1879. I'm sure it's much older than that. But of course, as it turns out, that reference is from the Malaysian branch. I think at the time the Straits branch of the Royal Asiatic Society. It was in an article that was published in 1879 of Malay proverbs, and Sepat in that publication from 1879 refers to a freshwater fish, a small-ish freshwater fish. It's not species specific, but it does mention that it's a freshwater fish and that it's widely consumed, dried, and salted. I think when we think of Sepet Siam and the other one, Sepet Jepun or the Mozambique tilapia, in both of these cases, I think the use of Sepet is a marker of introduced fish, because both fish are not naturally found in Malaya, in Singapore, or in Brunei. So the use of Sepet here is fish stories, but it's also a marker of perhaps foreignness, but then foreignness that becomes local. So there are kind of three things that I'm thinking about with this talk. One, it's exploratory, so it's very rough, and it's more of a sharing of some ideas. Second, it's experimental in the sense that I'm trying to suggest or introduce a method of doing history, which is following fish, the method being following fish or thinking with fish. That's kind of the experimental part. I want to see maybe or share at least what I think comes into view when we think about fish or when we follow fish, and what sort of places are brought in the story when we follow fish. And then finally, economic. I think of it really, this talk and the bigger project that it's a part of, as kind of a new kind of economic history. And this is a new kind of economic history that I think in many ways brings together or braids cultural history, environmental history, as well as environmental history. Oh, excuse me, environmental history, cultural history, and sort of food history, economic history. But all of this for me kind of is under the umbrella of a new kind of economic history. So fish as food, but fish also as specimen, as biodiversity, as agent. So the two fish that I reference in the abstract and that I'll draw attention to again here, Sepat Siam, which is the snakeskin gourami, and then Sepat Jepun, which is the Mozambique tilapia. And both have stories of introduction and then spread, and they're introduced for very similar reasons. So why Sepat? Why think about Sepat? Why even use the word Sepat? And also why Malayan freshwaters? And the reason for both has a lot to do with this person here, Eric Alfred. I hope most of you probably know who he is or who he was. So I'll say just a couple things about him, because he's really the motivation and the impetus behind not just this talk, but also my interest in freshwater fish more broadly. So in 1961, Eric Alfred, seen here, published, quote, Singapore freshwater fishes in the Malayan Nature Journal. In the wake of Gibson Hill's death in 1963, Alfred became, shortly thereafter, the first local director of the Raffles Museum. I think by the time he became director, maybe it was in 1966 or 67, it was known as the National Museum. But Alfred had been working at the museum since he finished his undergraduate degree in 1956. He joined the museum as the first local curator of zoology, So he was in charge of essentially natural history material, fish, and other things. His passion, it seemed, was certainly fish. And so he publishes this article in 1961. He then continues to do a lot of important research on freshwater fish of Singapore and of Malaya and of Malayan freshwater fish in the years after, publishing works in through the museum bulletin. So it was really Alfred that got me thinking about fish, and in response to Alfred's work, two of the fish that he talks about using the name Sepet Siam is one that shows up in that 1961 article, and the other one is Sepet Japun. That was the term that he used to describe the Mozambique tilapia. So that's where the two Sepets come from, and that's why Sepet and also why Malayan freshwaters. So it's really thinking about Alfred's role in this larger history that I'm going to try to share a bit about today. The other motivation for thinking about Malayan freshwaters in particular is the Dutch geologist's work, Molengraaf. So in 1921, Molengraaf publishes an article where he comes up, it's the first time that the term gets used, he creates it, and the term is Sundaland. Sundaland was a geological kind of zone. It encompassed Malaysia, or we should say maybe contemporary Malaysia, Singapore, Sumatra, Borneo, and Java. And while it was a geological space referring to a kind of a time when the waters were not water, that is the shallow water of Southeast Asia, seen here on the map that we have, the light blue being really the markers of this Sunda land, or the Sunda shelf, as it were. But Molengraaf also talks about a river system that existed with that geologic zone. And so it's a mix of river systems, old ancient river systems, and the shelf/land that he comes up with this term Sundaland. And I bring it up because I'm not so interested so much in Molengraaf or the geology of this, but this term, Sundaland, becomes extremely important to this day for freshwater biologists. It's a term, it's a biogeography that freshwater biologists, particularly working on Southeast Asia, use today. So it's a term that started, literally was born in 1921, but today is part of the lexicon when talking about freshwater biodiversity in Southeast Asia. So what does it look on the map? That's essentially the shape of it on the map. We've got Malaya or Malaysia covered, Sumatra, Singapore, Borneo, and Java. That's Sundaland. This is Sundaland as imagined by the Conservation International. And this is a very interesting sort of geography. And basically, this is a hotspot, which is another aspect of my talk today that I want to, or another motivation, which is biodiversity loss, extinction and extirpation, the loss of globally of freshwater species and the loss of freshwater fish locally. So extirpation and extinction. And this is that zone, Sundaland, that Molengraaf invented, but that has become quite naturalized within the discourse and studies of freshwater biodiversity. So a few things about freshwater fish. This is another motivation for the talk and trying to sort of, in a way, sort of situate it. Most extinctions that are happening today are happening among freshwater fish, and the decline is quite rapid. It's rapid and it's happening quickly. The drivers for this decline, this rapid decline, are sort of two. There's two really big drivers. Habitat loss, so things and changes that are happening to river systems or to lakes. That's one big driver, but the other is invasive species, species that are introduced to new ecosystems that then take over and cause harm to native fauna. And so those are really the big drivers of species extinction, particularly among freshwater fish. And it's important to say, too, that among all fish species known in the world, more than half are freshwater fish. So the significance of freshwater biodiversity is really, it's really important. And I think historically, it's something that's been understudied. In terms of invasive species, one of the big reasons for invasive species, or the introduction of non-native fish into freshwater systems, is aquaculture. And this graph here from the FAO in 2022 points to the radical increase in aquaculture as a main source of food production. So in 1950, it was something, quite small, a few percentage points. I think it's like 4%. And then by 2022 or by 2020, that number has increased to more than half of the world's supply of aquatic food is coming from aquaculture. The largest farmed fish in terms of its contribution to aquaculture is the common carp. The second largest farmed fish in terms of its production of aquaculture, or its share of aquaculture, is tilapia, seen here, tilapia. So that's the other important reason why I want to talk about tilapia, but also the Sepet siam, because both are fish that were introduced for food purposes. So I'm going to start now with the first fish, which is Sepet siam, and it's seen here on the right with the orange dots. And this comes from a book published in 1951, really the first Thai book of Thai fish. So it's a book published by Thai authors, one author named Suvati, who also does the illustrations, and it's called, in translation, it's called Drawings of Thai Fishes. And why do I start there with the Sepet siam story? Because this fish, prior to 1900 or prior to 1898, this fish, Sepet siam, did not exist anywhere outside of its native range. And its native range was the Mekong and Chao Phraya river deltas. So it was found nowhere else in the world up until 1898. An important thing that I use to kind of find out and figure out and follow fish and their stories are checklists. And this is a checklist that's been very important, both for the mapping and tracing of Sepet siam, but also for the tilapia. This is a checklist that was produced or created by a team at the Lee Kong Chin Natural History Museum and also at the National University of Singapore. And its lead author is Hyok Wee Tan, the curator of fish at the Lee Kong Chin Natural History Museum, who is a close colleague and friend of mine. And so working with Hyok, I've gotten so interested in the stories of the fish that he includes, or him and his team included, in this checklist. This is the most comprehensive checklist of non-native fish in Singapore. They recognize, Hyok and team recognizes that the first real effort to document freshwater fish of Singapore was done by Eric Alfred in the 1960s. So that's part of the history. But the fish themselves, the species themselves that are included in this list, have their own histories. And both what I do in my class, but what I do in my research, is take a list like this and sort of figure out what is the history of this fish from A to B, from home country to Singapore, and then where does it go from there? And in looking at this list, I wanted to know and try to map out the oldest fish introduced, or the oldest non-native fish found in Singapore. And based on the checklist, that oldest fish was and remains the Sepet siam. Its scientific name is Trichopodus pectoralis, and it's seen here with the orange box. And so what do we know about that fish? It's included in Hyok's checklist. Well, we know a few things about it. We know that Hanish, who was a cockroach specialist who was also working at the Raffles Museum, he had described a fish in the collection of the museum as Oreochromis siamenis. Where do we get that? We get that from this list. Dunker, a German ichthyologist who had made a collection of fish while in Singapore and passed these fish to the museum. And here we get the list of the fish that were identified in the collection made by Dunker and passed to the museum. And there where that orange dot is, we have Oreochromis siamenis. This is the kind of, this is the Sepet siam, but it's not yet described as such. In addition, what we get from this list that Hyok, Hui, and Tan provide, and just to point out, the reference there under the fish, you see Hanish 1901, 1904, and again, the kind of synonym of the fish, Oreochromis siamenis. But the next name on that list that Hyok, Hui, and team provide is Regan. And this is where we get the taxonomy of the contemporary fish or the current fish in terms of its joining the trigaster, and then it's renamed or it's reorganized under Trichopodus. So this is where it becomes part of the gourami family. I want to turn to that one now, just to point that out. So this is an important addition, the Regan addition, because it's through Regan's description of the Sepet siam, its common name, it's through the description of Sepet siam that we then get the first real taxonomy of this fish. Interestingly, it's a fish seen here, number one, Trichopodus pectoralis, published in 1909 by Regan. Interestingly, this fish, Trichopodus pectoralis, is collected in Singapore, used to describe this new species, and hence the name Trichopodus pectoralis. But the interesting thing is, it's the type specimen, the specimen collected from Singapore, but it's a non-native fish. So we have a very strange case of a non-native fish being used to describe a new species. In terms of the history of fish and freshwater fish, that's not a very common development. Most fish are described based on specimens collected from their home waters. Very rarely are specimens described based on specimens collected from outside their home waters. And yet, here's a case of that happening. This is the type specimen, and this is made possible, the type specimen, the digital image of the type specimen is made possible through an amazing and pioneering initiative of the Lee Kong Chian Natural History Museum. It's a project called Signify, and Signify and its team, they identify Singapore specimens in museums across the world, and then they work with teams both at those museums and at the Lee Kong Chian to digitize those type specimens or those specimens, those Singapore specimens, and to digitize them in such high quality so that researchers anywhere in the world could use them for morphological studies, taxonomic studies, and a host of other studies. So there isn't a need necessarily to repatriate the specimen, but instead make available this really high resolution image. And that's what we have here. Signify was able to do this. And through the team, in particular, Tricia Cho, who is part of that team, they've made this image available to me. So I want to share with it because it points out a few things. We've got the label seen on the right, the name that Dunker had used, Ostromanius siamenis, seen there. That was the name that Dunker used. It was the name that Reagan had written on the label. And then we've got on the left corner, Singapore, the locality, the type locality. But again, that type locality is interesting because it's a non-native location for this fish. But what we do know is by 1909, this fish is already established in the freshwaters of Singapore, and we learn a bit more about it as we investigate. So going back to this piece by Hyo Kui, we've got the first name there, Hanish, and we see where that comes into play. It's not described as a fish, but it's included as a specimen in the collection. And then we've got the second reference, Reagan, where the fish is described and it's given a new name, and it's taxonomically known now as Trichopodus pectoralis, and that's this story. And then what we get from Hyo Kui's piece as well is reference to Smith 1898. Smith 1898, and that's an important note, and it's in the notes on the top right. It's in the notes that that Hyo and team provide. And so then if we turn to that document, and there's the fish again, the type specimen. If we turn to that piece, or the piece by Smith, the date is 1898, but the publication date is 1933. And this is an important publication because Hugh Smith, the author of the publication, was an ichthyologist based in Bangkok. And he had communicated with the museum in Singapore, the Raffles Museum, about some specimens that he was inquiring on. It was essentially specimens that folks in Singapore were writing to Hugh on, and these were specimens of Sepet Siam, but they hadn't been able to provide the actual specimens. They were just providing queries in communication. And that's essentially what Hugh Smith recounts in this piece published in the Natural History Supplement of the Siam Society. It's important because it's in that publication that we then get the earliest date of this fish in waters outside of Thailand. And the quote is there down below. The fish Sepet Siam, as it's popularly known, this is its common name, was introduced into Singapore about 35 years ago and into the Krian district in Perak about 20 years ago. And so we've got two instances of this fish being documented through this correspondence in Singapore and in Malaysia. First in Singapore, roughly 1898, 35 years before 1933, and then in 20 years before 1933 in the Krian district in Perak. This is kind of, I think, what I would say, this is the method of following fish. We follow the documents and piece together the history that, that kind of comes together through these different specimen stories. Here we've got, again, reference to the Sepet Siam. It's known as, in Thai, as pla salad. And what is known about that fish in this document is that it was popular, widely consumed, and exported in dried, as a kind of dried fish, as a staple commodity in the export business of Thailand. And this was a fish, if we go through the records, a fish that was showing up quite common in various newspaper accounts. And given the significance of the Krian district in Perak, and the presence of this very important freshwater fish, originally from Thailand, now naturalized and found in the waters of Perak. We then get this important study done by Sung Min Kong, who was a fisheries expert who worked in the fisheries department, and he would then become the director of fisheries in the post-war period. In his study, it's specifically titled Sepet Siam because that's the way in which the fish is known. And he too recounts how it was introduced into Krian in 1921, and since then it has multiplied and established itself in the rice-growing areas of Krian. And it's that important bit about the rice-growing areas of Krian that I want to kind of offer some additional thoughts in terms of economic history and environmental history and cultural history. So Sepet Siam is a fish that's widely grown in rice fields. It's a fish that is deeply associated with farmer food security. Most farmers grow rice often for others to consume. Certainly some portion of the rice that farmers grow in Malaya and in other parts of Southeast Asia, like Indonesia or the Philippines, certainly portions of what folks grow is consumed by the farmers, but more often than not, the bulk of the rice that's produced is generally for trade or for export, so for trade. And what that does is it creates a kind of food insecurity among these farming communities. Sometimes not enough protein, depending on the local supply. And with the introduction of this fish in the 1920s, this fish became widely grown in the rice fields, and it was the sole property, the Sepet Siam word, the sole property of the farmers. And so what would happen is in the growing of the rice cycle, the rice would be harvested, and at the same time, these fish, these Sepet Siam, would then be harvested too. And that supply would be for the farmers and for the farming community. And of course, portions of that would be exported or traded or made available locally. This is an important element of this particular fish's environmental and economic story because that ability to grow in rice fields, often muddy water, perhaps at times stagnant, generally shallow, so paddy water, that ability to grow and thrive in that kind of environment meant that this was a very suitable fish for introduction to other areas outside of Malaya, outside of Singapore. This is just a quick newspaper clipping about the story of the Sepet Siam in Perak and how it was growing both across the district and also the state. And then from Perak, we get this fish being introduced into other districts and states of Malaya. This one, speaking to 1926, being introduced to Negeri Sembilan. The important thing about this particular, I think, source, which comes from the NLB, is that it also makes reference to illustrated notices in Romanized and Jawi Malay advocating Sepet Siam's cultivation. So essentially, the fisheries department utilizing different language channels to promote the adoption of this important freshwater fish. If anybody has these illustrations or know where I might be able to find them, I would certainly love to be in touch with you. Here is that same fish, Trichopodus pectoralis, though it's mislabeled by Chevet, a French ichthyologist, as Trichopodus trichopateris. which is the scientific name for the, I think it's a 2 or 3 spotted gourami. And this is clearly not that. This is the snakeskin gourami. But why do I include this? Because Chevet is based in Indochina, mostly in Nha Trang on the coast of Vietnam. And this was a fish that was identified and collected through the expedition of the Lenaesan, which was a scientific expedition that the fisheries department in Vietnam had led in the 1920s, and this was a fish that came up in those travels, and they visited, I should say, and this is an important connection to the fish. The Lenaesan visited Singapore as well as other ports of Malaya. So this would have been a fish perhaps seen in Singapore, but certainly seen in the other areas that they traveled to in the 1920s. Moving a little bit outside of Sundaland, well, excuse me, staying within Sundaland, but moving a little bit outside of the zone of Malaysia, Singapore, and Brunei, and turning a little bit to Indonesia, it's important because if we follow this fish from Malaya, and its introductions to other places, starting with Krian in 1921, Negri Sembilan in 1926. In 1934, supply of sepet siam are sent from Singapore to Java. And they're introduced there in Java as a food fish that would be a good addition to the protein supply, and that also would be suitable for growing in rice paddies. From 1934, when that fish is introduced to Java, 20 fry, meaning 20 young fish, are introduced. It then spreads across Java in 1936, and then it's introduced to South Sulawesi, or Celebes at the time, but today, South Sulawesi, into the Lake Tempe, in 1937. So this one fish, which in many ways started its history outside of Thailand in Singapore in 1898, is described as the type specimen for the species in 1909, 1910, again from Singapore, then is introduced to the Krian district in the 1920s, from there to Negri Sembilan in 1926. From Singapore, or now from, let's say, Malaya, to Java in 1934, and from Java, it covers the archipelago from Java to Sulawesi and eventually to Sumatra, all in the 1930s. So here we have an illustration of sepet siam. This is done in 1941. Again, the fish was introduced in 1937. And we see the fish down there on the bottom, and under its current, or it's not its current, but it's taxonomized name by Reagan, Trigaster pectoralis. It's then renamed Trichopodus pectoralis. So this just furthers the introduction. By the 1950s, this fish from Malaya is now going to Colombo, to Sri Lanka, to Ceylon. And it's important to point out that at this point, it's really now widely known as a Malayan fish. It's no longer a foreign fish. It's still called sepet siam, but it's also described as a Malayan fish, a localized, indigenized, native-ish type fish. Just a few more introductions that I want to highlight. Sepet siam is introduced to Sarawak in 1935. It shows up there from Malaya in 1935. It's introduced to New Guinea in 1956 from Singapore, and it's introduced to Pakistan in 1957 from Penang. So we've got Malaya outsourcing and exporting this Thai fish, which becomes a Malay fish, to other parts of the region, which really in many ways kind of braids the region together through this fish story. It's introduced to the Philippines from Malaysia and Singapore, specifically from Singapore to the Philippines in 1938. From the Philippines, Sepet Siam goes to New Caledonia in 1956. I want to just come back to this fish because that is that long story of movement and of exchange that is embedded in this checklist, but that is more importantly embedded in this specimen, this species, Sepet Siam. And I think by thinking with fish, we see how all these different kinds of places kind of come into view. Sarawak and Papua New Guinea, the Philippines and Ceylon, Java, Sulawesi, and Singapore. All of these places are tied together through a single species that in many ways had its origin story in Singapore. I want to go to another fish story, and that is Ikan Mujair, or Sepet Japun. I don't probably have much time here, I think, so I think we might end in about, Daniel, could I maybe have about 5 minutes or 10 minutes?
Yes, definitely.
Okay, is 10 minutes okay?
Yep.
Okay, great. So I'm going to cut to the chase on the Sepet Japun story, which is published as a chapter in Singapore Creatures if you want to get the full experience. But the Cliff Note version is this is a fish that is the second oldest fish in Kyokui's checklist. So the first was Sepet Siam, the second fish on that checklist in terms of the second oldest introduced fish is Sepet Japun, or the Mozambique tilapia. So Alfred in the 60s refers to both fish as Sepet Siam and Sepet Japun. It's a fish that was found in the Botanic Gardens in 1961. It's a fish that's native to Africa, where cichlids are. That's the family of fish in which it's a part. These are some of the cichlids that are found in Singapore. Again, though, the oldest cichlid, tilapia in Singapore is the common tilapia, or the Mozambique tilapia. Here we see it again, the Mozambique tilapia, the male version on the top, the bottom version on the bottom, and this was an image taken by Hyokui. These are some of the areas in which tilapia are identified. I'm going to skip a few things. This is really where this fish's story starts. So if the Sepet Siam story is non-native to Singapore, but it shows up there in terms of the story and its spread, of course, native to Thailand, but outside of Thailand, the first place that it's found is Singapore. Similarly, the tilapia story begins in Africa, but it really begins for us in Java. And it's in Java that it takes on a name called Ikan Mujair. And that name is because the guy who discovered it, Haji Mujair, gets recognized by the Dutch as the person who found it. He grew it in his backyard. This is a skeleton map of it. I'm going to kind of just touch on perhaps just a couple quick points about the Mujair story. One, it's associated with Haji Mujair. This is Haji Mujair's burial site in Blitar in Java. And here you have his burial site and the fish, because he's so closely associated. Here he is on the left, the old man on the left, that's Haji Mujair. But that fish goes from being in Indonesia in the 1930s to being introduced to Singapore in 1944. And we know that date from both archival sources, but also from Kyokui's checklist. He indicates that 1944 was when the tilapia gets introduced. And 1944, of course, is when the Japanese occupied Singapore, and they were interested in finding a reliable food source for the populations that were in Singapore. And so they flew to Singapore from Java 126 tilapias to be grown in Singapore, which they were, in one pond known as Potong, in an area called Potong Pasir. So Potong Pasir is the epicenter. It's the ground zero for the tilapia story. That's where they were introduced, Potong Pasir, and from there they spread all across the island. The Japanese published a book called About Ikan Mujair. So this is a kind of manual, how to publish, how to grow it, why you should grow it. But we learn about that introduction to Singapore through newspapers and through other kinds of sources. From Singapore, that fish just goes all over the place. And I'll end with maybe this final point, which is it's a fish that was introduced to Singapore, but nobody wanted to eat it. And it meant that there was an overabundance of this fish available, but nobody was consuming it. Floods and other things meant that this fish went from being in ponds to being in the native waterways. It got acclimatized, it naturalized, and it quickly became part of the environment in Singapore. And that's how Alfred describes it. But nobody was consuming it. And so the Singapore government in the late 40s and 50s decided we will export live tilapia to the world. And so Singapore did, introducing a genetic strand that started in Singapore, really started in Java, furthered in Singapore. And from Singapore, we can find this fish now in just about every part of the Indian Pacific Ocean world. And its origin begins in Singapore. I think I'll end there and take any questions that people might have.
Thank you so much, Anthony. I think it's fascinating to, if we had another hour, we could have probably gone even deeper into both stories, especially the story of the tilapia. These are stories of movement, of migration, of how these things happen in, I would say, in conjunction with historical events as well. But I think I thought to perhaps just start off this response with perhaps a comment that's a little bit cast a bit more broadly. And I think listening to your talk today, I'm really struck by how it leads us to question what is native. The tilapia, for example, is a fish, like as you point out, it's almost assumed and referred to as native to Singapore, if not this part of the world. And of course, as we look at its story, we see how it's introduced. We see how unnatural in that sense that migration has been. So the question, of course, has certain parallels to, I guess, what we consider native, both in terms of biodiversity, but even for human populations as well, isn't it? We talk about who is original or indigenous, and sometimes the question is how far back we go. In the case of biodiversity, how I just thought to perhaps ask that question as well. How far back do we go when we think about native? And with the Sepat Siam, you mentioned the origins in Thailand, but yet at the same time we could also sort of consider its origins in Singapore in 1898. So how does that lead you to think about such questions in a broader sense?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's an important one. This binary between native and non-native, while it holds, I think, to some extent, relevance and importance for some disciplines, other disciplines and other ways of thinking, it doesn't really have the same kind of value. And I think hopefully what I'm trying to, I probably didn't do it so well, but what I'm wanting to say with fish is that these binaries really disappear, they fall apart, they don't hold their water when we think about how fish might be from somewhere, but they quickly become naturalized. They quickly become part of an ecosystem, and they become, in many ways, heritage. Heritage fish, part of food heritage, part of biodiversity heritage. So just thinking about Sepet Siam and the tilapia, gouramis and tilapias, while introduced, are now completely established in Brunei, in Singapore, in Malaysia. And as they're established, they are part of the food web of biodiversity. Things rely on them just as much as they rely on things. And I think there's a lot of lessons that we can take from this kind of biodiversity perspective and think about it in terms of cultural movements, cultural practices, human flows. I think the binary gets reinforced, but in fact, it's much messier than a simple native versus non-native. I think the story is much messier. I guess I should say the story is much messier, and that's what interests me with fish, and we see that as well with cultural movements as well. Yeah.
And it's really when these species start intersecting and start embedding themselves in cultural histories, in economic histories, that their status and in turn how we view them, that changes as well, I suppose.
That's exactly it. I mean, and I think that going back to kind of the experimental and the economic, this is my thinking of how when we look at economic things, tilapia or gourami, these identities really evolve quickly, and they become quite embedded in cultural practices, and I think that's worth thinking about. So fish can point it to us to lots of different kinds of directions.
Thank you. Perhaps on that note, I might open the questions to the floor as well. I was wondering if anyone in our presence today had any thoughts, comments along these broader lines, or perhaps something more specific to ask. I do see a comment by William. William, would you like to jump in on this call and share your question?
Oh, sure. I can just read the question. I can read the question out loud if that's all right.
Oh, yes, of course.
Okay, great. So I guess so. Thank you so much for the talk today, and building on this broader discussion that we're having about nativity, the foreignness of a particular species. Would you be able to comment a bit more about sort of anthropogenic induced changes to particular populations? I think we're looking at fish in this case because they're very mobile, and presumably given the effects of climate change and distributions of populations afterwards, would it still make sense of us to talk about what is native, what is foreign, and whether or not that's problematic, whether or not that might be problematic?
Yeah, that's a super question, William, and thanks so much. I've got this slide here because I wanted to point out, thinking along the lines of your question here, almost anticipating it in some ways, climate change is totally changing the range in which species can thrive and exist. So this is a recent study from the University of Hawaii, and there are cold water areas on the island of Oahu. These cold water areas have within them very specific, very specialized fish.
While we are here?
Yeah.
Huh?
Hello?
Was you were listening to the talk. You were listening to the talk, right?
No, I was listening and reading.
If I could trouble you to mute yourself if you're not on making a comment right now. Thank you. Sorry, Anthony.
No, so I guess the point, William, that I wanted to make here with this slide and just to address your question directly, climate change is certainly changing the boundaries in which species are being found and where they can thrive. This is a study that was recently done by the University of Hawaii, but we can find probably a bunch of other examples. I mean, mosquitoes and the range in which mosquitoes are spreading from some regions to other regions because of the warming environment or the warming waters or the like. I think as a scholar who thinks about these things, I'm a little bit allergic to using the kind of the binary native and non-native. I'm allergic to that because I think it pushes us into a kind of conventional way of thinking about things, or a more traditional way. And I think in today's world, there's so much flux, so much movement, and there's always been so much flux, so much movement, that these categories are actually quite unstable. That being said, tilapia may thrive in Singapore and have no impact on the native fish fauna in Singapore, but that's not the case of tilapia in other places. In other places, tilapia, like in a lake, like Lake Toba in Indonesia, tilapia wreaks havoc on native fauna because as a non-native fish, it just thrives on the vegetation and it crowds out and colonizes things that native fish would do. So while on the one hand, the binary native, non-native, I think is a little bit unproductive. On the other hand, it still has some value in certain contexts. So I think where and when matters for us to think about these things.
Okay. Thanks so much.
Thanks, William. Thank you very much.
Thank you, William. And on the topic of binaries, I guess the discussion has led me to consider as well if the kind of distinctions that we make between human and non-native and non-human histories is sometimes a little bit too separate as well. And I think the talk that we had today really looks at how even from the perspective of a non-human history of the Sepat Siam and the Sepat Jepun, clearly the human agents are present, and they've largely behind these movements, and that there is a kind of cross influence between the human and the non-human species, and that for me, as somebody working largely on human histories, I think there is definitely more room to look at the non-human agents in the telling of that part of history.
I would, if I can say just a couple things on that, Daniel.
Sure.
I think for me, what's so interesting about fish is that they offer this kind of human, non-human assemblage. Where we follow fish, or when we follow fish, there are always human actors involved, either collecting or describing or illustrating or raising or trying to exterminate. So I think my thinking with this project is kind of, it's not just a human story, it's not just a non-human story, but it's really seeing these two stories as entangled, braided, and very much offering us, I think, a richer understanding of history and its importance in Southeast Asia. And I would add, a great source of information on fish that I've drawn on, that is available out there, is the archive of MBRAS, the Malaysian branch of Asiatics, or the Asiatic Society's journal, has been so foundational because of the long history that people have been interested in fish. So we've got articles in there from the 19th century about Malay names of fish, and we've got articles from the 1920s, 30s, and 40s and 50s about the collection of fish. So the Royal Asiatic Society's journal has been, I think, it's a critical, I think, resource for wanting to do a kind of human, non-human history of the region. And I think anybody thinking along those lines, or a kind of biodiversity history thinking along those lines, would really be, they would be so enriched if they were to turn to the branch and its journal, because of so much material that's there. Both, obviously material that offers a lot of perspectives, but there's also a great way to kind of read important local perspectives from those documents too. And I've relied a lot on them for names, for places, for stories.
Well, thank you so much, Anthony, for the kind words. I'm so glad the journal has been a great resource for you, and I think in coming full circle, you giving this talk has continued to forward that research and help us to think about the relevance of such migratory patterns today, as they intersect with the natural world, with the economic world, with the cultural world. So once again, thank you so much, Anthony, for the talk today. Thank you for the stories you've shared of these two fish. I think there may be more stories out there. I understand you're working on an ongoing book project as well, on natural histories, and I really look forward to that. And on behalf of the society as well, we wish you the very best in pursuing that project, and we hope to hear more from you, especially when more comes out.
Okay, thank you so much, Daniel, for this opportunity, and I want to thank again the Royal Asiatic Society, because it is a huge, important community, and I'm really honored to be able to share these thoughts with you all. Yeah, thank you again. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you, and thank you one and all for joining us today. Have a great afternoon, everyone.